It all began on a crisp Tuesday morning, the kind where the sunlight slices through the trees just right, making the land shimmer with an almost magical glow. I had just stepped out onto my property, my boots crunching softly over the gravel, when the familiar hum of a city lawyer's sedan echoed down the winding lane. The Homeowners Association, Ashwood Heights, of course, had sent their so-called legal envoy, a man in an ill-fitting gray suit who looked more like he belonged in a budget law commercial than on a courtroom floor. They claimed I had encroached on their precious community greenbelt, a strip of land I'd walked, mowed, and maintained for years, believing it was merely part of the property I had legally acquired long before their HOA bylaws were even drafted. As he approached, I could feel the simmering arrogance radiating from him, like he thought he could intimidate me with his clipboard and carefully scripted threats. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my deeds and my investments settle around me, the barns I built, the orchard I nurtured, the little pond where my kids learned to fish, all under my name, all legally mine. And yet, here they were, waving papers in the air like I was some delinquent neighbor, unaware that every inch of this disputed land was documented in deeds, surveys, and tax records. The absurdity was almost laughable, if it weren't so infuriating. I calmly tipped my hat, gesturing to the sprawling landscape, and said, with a hint of controlled amusement, "I suppose we're here to discuss boundaries, are we?" But inside, I already knew the game was theirs to play, and I held a secret that would turn their strategy on its head, a lease they didn't even know existed, a lease that put me in control of the very courtroom where they intended to humiliate me. As the gray-suited lawyer unfolded the stack of papers with an exaggerated flourish, I couldn't help but notice the way his polished shoes caught the morning sun, glinting like he thought that mere appearances could lend weight to his argument. He cleared his throat, an almost theatrical sound, and began to enumerate every complaint, every minor infraction, every imagined encroachment he believed he had documented against me over the past decade. There were claims about fencing, tree placements, slight deviations in the landscaping, and even accusations about the small gravel path that led to the pond, which, according to them, supposedly interfered with the communal view corridor. I listened with a polite nod, masking the amusement that was bubbling beneath the surface. Each of his points was laughably pedantic, a showcase of bureaucratic nitpicking designed to frustrate and intimidate. I could feel my children's laughter echoing faintly from the farmhouse behind me as they chased a stray dog through the orchard, unaware that some paper-pushing bureaucrat thought he could dictate the boundaries of my life with a stapler and a clipboard. I shifted my weight, hands tucked casually into my jacket pockets, letting the tension simmer like the heat of a low afternoon sun over a quiet prairie. Then, with a careful, measured tone that I had cultivated over years of dealing with pompous officials, I asked him a simple question: "Have you checked the lease agreement for the county courthouse on Ashwood Boulevard?" His eyebrows shot up, a flicker of confusion crossing his otherwise stoic features, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile, as if he had rehearsed a response for every possible scenario except this one. The truth was, I held in my possession the lease to the very courtroom where their threats of legal action would have been executed. I had negotiated it quietly years ago, a move most would have considered overly cautious, but I had sensed that someday, someone would try to challenge my rights in a way that required more than deeds and surveys. And now that day had come. I leaned slightly forward, letting the weight of the morning sun catch the glint in my eyes, and continued, because, as it turns out, I control the courtroom, and any hearing you attempt to schedule there is effectively under my jurisdiction. His confident stance faltered ever so slightly, a micro-expression I caught because I had spent decades reading the nuances of human behavior. You could see the gears turning behind his eyes, a calculation attempting to weigh arrogance against the sudden, unforeseen reality that he was no longer in a position of authority. It was a rare, almost poetic moment, the mighty, self-assured HOA lawyer, confronted by a homeowner whose foresight and meticulous planning had rendered all their posturing impotent. I smiled inwardly, savoring the irony, the delicious justice of it all, knowing that the day's proceedings would soon take a turn that none of them had anticipated. And yet, I remained outwardly calm, letting him continue to speak, letting him believe for a few moments that his complaints held weight, all while I quietly prepared the next move, a sequence that would reveal not just my ownership, but the far-reaching implications of the lease I controlled. The papers in his hand seemed heavier now, almost comically so, as though the weight of the lawsuit itself had shifted. Every clause he read, every word he emphasized, inadvertently highlighted his own vulnerability, a vulnerability I was prepared to exploit with precise, surgical timing. I could sense his frustration building, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the slight shift in his stance, as he attempted to regain composure. Meanwhile, I allowed my mind to wander briefly across the expanse of my property, imagining the countless hours I had spent mapping boundaries, negotiating surveys, and quietly ensuring that every legal safeguard was in place. The barns, the pond, the orchard, the gravel path, all meticulously documented, all meticulously maintained. And now, the lease, the secret trump card, was the final piece of a puzzle designed to ensure that no arbitrary authority could ever undermine the rights I had earned through diligence, investment, and foresight. As he droned on, oblivious to the looming revelation, I felt a sense of satisfaction, a rare blend of amusement and vindication that comes only when you know the outcome long before your opponent does. I could almost see the scene unfolding in slow motion, the filing of papers, the attempted scheduling of hearings, the calls to court clerks, all rendered meaningless by a single lease, a single legal instrument that shifted the entire balance of power in my favor. And yet, I allowed the scene to play out in real time, savoring each microsecond of their impending confusion, each subtle twitch of disbelief as the reality sank in that their authority was not absolute, that my preparations had outpaced their assumptions, and that the arrogance of an HOA could never match the meticulousness of someone who had spent years thinking several steps ahead. I finally interrupted his recitation of complaints with a casual flick of my hand, as if dismissing a minor annoyance, and said, "Gentlemen, I think we should step into the courthouse. I have a document I believe you haven't accounted for." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling at the edge of a quiet town, the kind that makes people pause, reassess, and, often too late, realize that they have been outmaneuvered. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came. The realization was dawning, and it was as visible as the sunlight that danced across the fields behind him. I allowed the silence to stretch, letting it weigh on him, the tension mounting with every heartbeat, every rustle of the leaves, every distant bird call from the orchard. In that silence, I felt the culmination of years of strategy and preparation, the careful balancing of patience, foresight, and timing, all coalescing into this singular moment where I held complete control over what had seemed like a hostile situation. And just as the first crack of doubt appeared in his confident facade, I knew that the rest of the day would unfold according to a plan I had meticulously crafted, a plan that would ensure that the HOA's attempts at intimidation would not just fail, they would fail spectacularly, leaving them to confront the limits of their own authority while I remained, as I always had been, firmly in control of my own destiny. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the mood of the community, restless, expectant, and just a little uncertain. By mid-morning, I had already walked the full stretch of my property, as I always did before something significant. It wasn't superstition, it was grounding, a ritual of sorts. My boots left faint impressions in the damp earth, and the crisp air carried the scent of pine and wet soil. To me, it was a reminder of why I fought so hard to preserve what I had built, the land, the home, the independence that so many people had forgotten the value of. When I arrived at the courthouse, the scene was almost theatrical. The HOA members were already gathered outside, their expressions a mixture of smug anticipation and feigned professionalism. The president, Karen Whitmore, yes, the same Karen whose name had become infamous among neighbors, stood at the front with her arms crossed, tapping her manicured nails against a folder labeled Ashwood Heights vs. Miller. Her husband, a man who fancied himself the moral backbone of the community, stood beside her, his expression one of mild disdain, the kind of look people wear when they believe they're about to win something that isn't truly theirs. The lawyer, the same gray-suited figure from my property, greeted me with a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He still thought this was routine, that the law was a shield they could hide behind. He didn't yet realize that the ground beneath his feet had already shifted. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and polished wood, a blend that reminded me of all the county meetings and legal dealings I'd quietly managed over the years. What none of them seemed to know was that this very courtroom, the one they intended to use to humiliate me publicly, was operating under a long-term lease that placed control of its operation squarely in my hands. Years ago, when the county had run short of funds for facility maintenance, I had stepped in, signing a 25-year lease to keep the building operational in exchange for administrative oversight. It was a move I made more out of civic responsibility than strategy back then, but the irony of it now was impossible to ignore. The judge's bench, the rows of wooden seats, even the clerk's desk, every inch of it, technically, was under my authority. And when the HOA attorney filed their lawsuit, they had unknowingly scheduled their hearing in a space that required my approval for use. I took my seat at the defendant's table, setting down a plain leather folder containing copies of deeds, lease agreements, and property records so detailed they could have filled an archive. Across from me, the HOA representatives whispered among themselves, their whispers growing sharper as the minutes ticked by and the judge failed to appear. The attorney glanced toward the clock, then to the door, his confidence slowly beginning to falter. "He's usually punctual," he muttered under his breath, shuffling his notes. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, letting a faint smile tug at the corner of my mouth. "He is punctual," I replied evenly. "But I'm afraid there's been a scheduling oversight." Karen looked up sharply, her expression tightening. "What kind of oversight?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. I turned slightly toward her, meeting her gaze with calm, unhurried authority. "The kind," I said, "where the person you're suing also happens to control the lease of the building you're standing in. And as per the terms of that lease, all civil hearings conducted here must be approved by the lessor, in this case, me." The silence that followed was exquisite. It was the kind of silence that fills a room when people realize that their assumptions have been dismantled in an instant. The attorney blinked rapidly, his face losing a shade of color as he scrambled to comprehend what he'd just heard. That's not possible," he stammered. "The courthouse is county property." "Correct," I said, "but it's leased under a public-private partnership agreement due to budgetary shortfalls. The leaseholder, again, me, handles all operational logistics, including courtroom scheduling, maintenance, and, conveniently, approval of civil use. The county signs off on it, but I handle the day-to-day." I slid a certified copy of the lease agreement across the table toward him, the official seal glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. He scanned it with trembling hands, his lips moving silently as he read the clauses. When he reached the section bearing my name, he froze. Then came the inevitable stammer, this can't be, this has to be some kind of, it's not," I interrupted, my tone steady but not cruel. "You see, gentlemen, and ladies, the irony is that you filed to sue me over land ownership, but the court you chose to do it in operates under my authority. So, technically speaking, you're standing in my leased property right now, and without my authorization, this proceeding cannot legally continue." Karen's husband stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. You can't just own a courtroom," he blurted. I looked up at him calmly, letting his indignation burn itself out before answering. "I don't own the courtroom," I said, "I lease it. And with that lease comes oversight. You might want to check the county's public record before shouting." His face twisted, torn between disbelief and fury. The attorney fumbled through his briefcase, pulling out his phone to check the county website, and within moments, the truth was staring back at him in black and white: Ashwood County Courthouse Facility Leaseholder, James R. Miller. I could almost feel the collective air being sucked out of the room as the HOA representatives realized the implications. Their authority, their smug confidence, all evaporated in the space of a few seconds. Karen tried to regain control, straightening her blazer and fixing me with a cold, practiced glare. "This doesn't change the facts of the case," she said tightly. "You still encroached on community property." I leaned forward, folding my hands atop the table. "Community property that doesn't exist," I replied. "I have the original plats from before the subdivision was developed. The so-called greenbelt you're referring to was designated as private buffer land for drainage and soil preservation, owned by the previous rancher, who sold it directly to me before your HOA was even established. You're basing your claim on revised documents that your developer never had the authority to alter. You're suing me for land I've owned outright for 15 years. I opened the folder, revealing a stack of certified maps, surveys, and sale records, each bearing official seals and signatures. The lawyer's hands trembled as he flipped through them, his face growing paler with each page. These are legitimate," he muttered, almost to himself. "Where did you even file them?" I finished for him. "With the county clerk, same place your bylaws are supposed to be recorded, though I imagine your paperwork isn't quite as up to date." Karen's expression hardened into a brittle smile. "You think this little trick will scare us?" she said, voice sharp with false confidence. "We'll take this to another court. A real one." I stood slowly, the sound of my chair scraping against the wood floor echoing like a verdict. "You can try," I said, my voice low, steady. "But every court in this county rotates through this facility. The lease extends to all administrative operations within the jurisdiction. You'd have to go to the next county over, and even then, your filings would have to acknowledge the standing jurisdictional control of Ashwood County first." I let that sink in for a beat, then added, "And even if you somehow managed that, you'd still be faced with the fact that your claim has no legal foundation. You can't sue for land that was never yours, and you certainly can't win a case in a courtroom you don't have permission to use." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the faint hum of the overhead lights and the rhythmic tapping of rain beginning to fall against the windows. The attorney finally sank back into his chair, defeated, while Karen's carefully maintained facade began to crack. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that her empire of petty control had finally met a wall she couldn't climb. She had built her influence through fear and manipulation, through fines and violations and intimidation tactics, but none of that mattered here. The law wasn't her toy anymore. I gathered my documents, tucking them neatly back into the folder, and walked toward the bench. "For what it's worth," I said, turning back to them, "I don't enjoy embarrassing people. I believe in fairness. I believe in responsibility. But you came after me with bad faith, with arrogance, and with ignorance of the very laws you claim to uphold. Maybe next time, before you threaten someone over land, you'll take the time to understand where you actually stand." Then I signed a single sheet of paper, a formal notice suspending the courtroom's availability for all non-criminal HOA filings until further review, and handed it to the clerk. "Effective immediately," I said. The clerk nodded, stamping it with a heavy thud that echoed through the silent room. The HOA members stared, stunned, as the reality of their defeat settled in. As I walked out into the rain, the chill on my skin felt strangely cleansing. The storm clouds had begun to break apart, thin shafts of sunlight piercing through to illuminate the courthouse steps. I paused at the top, looking out over the town I had lived in for most of my life. It wasn't victory that I felt, it was relief. Relief that truth, for once, had outweighed arrogance. Relief that the quiet diligence of a single man had outmatched the noisy machinery of self-importance. Behind me, I could hear the muffled arguments of the HOA members echoing faintly from inside the courthouse, voices raised, accusations flying, desperation seeping into every syllable. But I didn't need to listen. The outcome was already sealed, not through vengeance or manipulation, but through foresight and integrity. I had played their game, but on my terms, and now they had to live with the results. I stepped off the last stair, feeling the solid earth beneath my boots again. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, the kind that softens the edges of the world, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of my children laughing, their voices carried on the wind from the direction of home. I smiled to myself, the tension of weeks finally easing from my shoulders. Let them file, let them posture, let them talk. The land was mine, the law was clear, and the courtroom, ironically, poetically, was leased in my name. The days following the courthouse confrontation felt almost surreal, as though the entire town was collectively holding its breath, waiting to see what ripple effect my actions would cause. The HOA, once the self-proclaimed moral compass of the community, had been publicly humiliated in a way that no amount of self-promotion could undo. Word spread fast, of course. Social media was buzzing with screenshots of documents, photographs of the courthouse notice I had filed, and first-hand accounts from neighbors who had witnessed the exchange. I had anticipated some blowback, perhaps whispered resentments or awkward nods at neighborhood meetings, but the scale of the reaction exceeded even my expectations. People were curious, astonished, and, in many cases, relieved. Relief came from those who had been silently oppressed by the HOA's petty fines, their passive-aggressive letters, and the endless surveillance of every minor detail on their properties. I had never sought recognition, never chased fame. My victories were always quiet, calculated, and deeply satisfying in a personal way. But now, there was a palpable sense of justice, not revenge, but the restoration of balance. I could feel it in the way neighbors looked at me, a mixture of admiration and awe tempered by the recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Even the local press picked up the story, framing it in their usual dramatic fashion, exaggerating the conflict while simultaneously validating the legality and audacity of my actions. The headline in the regional newspaper read, "Homeowner outsmarts HOA using courthouse lease, a legal David versus Goliath." It was, of course, sensationalized, but it also captured the essence of what had transpired. Every detail was accurate: the courthouse lease, the documented land ownership, the stunned reactions of the HOA members, though the editors had taken some liberty with adjectives and phrasing to heighten the drama. I didn't mind, the narrative was largely truthful, and for the first time in years, the public discourse was on my side. Meanwhile, inside the HOA, chaos reigned. Karen Whitmore, whose aura of invincibility had been her trademark, now faced endless questions from board members, residents, and attorneys alike. She tried to maintain composure, issuing statements that attempted to downplay the situation as a misunderstanding or clerical error, but the evidence was irrefutable. Every document, every photograph, every seal stamped in official ink reinforced a reality she could not argue away. Her husband fumed in the background, a shadow of his former self, muttering about reputations and lost authority while failing to grasp that the foundation of their control had been built on assumptions, not facts. The more they tried to assert themselves, the more public opinion swung against them, and within days, several board members resigned quietly, unwilling to be associated with a leadership so thoroughly undermined. Those who remained attempted damage control, sending letters to residents promising reforms and better governance, but the words rang hollow. Once the community had seen the lengths to which I had prepared, the meticulous attention to legality, and the audacity of leveraging the courthouse lease, the HOA's former image of omnipotence crumbled irreversibly. People began questioning other policies, other fines, other arbitrary rules, and the cracks in their authority widened into chasms. I observed all of this with measured satisfaction. My intention had never been to ruin lives or sow discord, it had been to defend my property, my family, and my rights. But justice, when executed with precision and integrity, has a way of cascading beyond the immediate players, illuminating broader truths. The legal ramifications were equally fascinating. Lawyers who had previously advised the HOA found themselves double-checking every clause of their bylaws, every recorded plat map, every supposed community easement. Several of them reached out to me, ostensibly for professional advice, though I knew their real motive was to understand how I had discovered the loophole they had all overlooked. I explained nothing, smiled politely, and let them figure it out on their own. It was a lesson in humility, one that only comes when individuals confront the consequences of assuming power without comprehension. Court clerks, too, had to adjust procedures, adding new protocols for verifying leaseholder authority before scheduling hearings. The ripple effect extended into county administration. Supervisors called meetings to ensure that public-private partnerships like the one I had leveraged were properly accounted for, and that no future conflicts of this magnitude could arise without forewarning. It was remarkable, in a quiet, almost academic way, to observe how a single act of preparation and insight could reshape bureaucratic procedures on multiple levels. At home, the contrast could not have been starker. My children ran freely through the orchard and fields, unaware of the intricacies of property law or courthouse leases, their laughter mingling with the sounds of farm animals and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. My spouse and I shared long evenings on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of orange and purple, reflecting on the events of the past week. There was a sense of relief, yes, but also of responsibility, a recognition that such victories require careful stewardship. With the HOA weakened, the temptation for new, equally overbearing groups to rise was always present. I knew that maintaining balance required vigilance, fairness, and continued attention to detail. Yet, I allowed myself a moment of quiet pride, savoring the knowledge that my diligence had protected not just my family and property, but also the integrity of the community as a whole. My children would inherit a neighborhood where boundaries were respected, where authority was earned, and where courage in the face of arrogance could prevail. The personal satisfaction of victory was intertwined with a broader understanding of societal dynamics. Power, I realized, often thrives in the ignorance of others, those who assume compliance without scrutiny, those who believe that fear and procedure can substitute for truth. But when foresight, preparation, and a thorough understanding of one's rights are combined, even the most overbearing institutions can be held accountable. I had become, in effect, a guardian not through confrontation alone, but through strategic thinking, patience, and meticulous record-keeping. And in doing so, I had demonstrated a truth that resonated far beyond my immediate conflict: the law, when understood and respected, serves justice; when assumed or ignored, it becomes a tool for the arrogant to manipulate. The HOA's collapse, quiet, procedural, undeniable, served as a testament to this principle. As the weeks passed, residents began approaching me openly, sharing stories of minor grievances they had suffered under the HOA, asking questions, seeking guidance. I listened, offered advice sparingly, and encouraged them to document and defend their rights. The community's culture shifted subtly but irreversibly. The days of unchecked authority were over, replaced by awareness, accountability, and mutual respect. And while I never sought recognition or fame, there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that, in this small corner of the world, truth had prevailed, not through force or intimidation, but through careful preparation, foresight, and unwavering integrity. The courthouse lease, the detailed maps, the legal foresight, all had converged into a single decisive moment that altered the balance of power permanently. It was, I realized, more than just a personal victory. It was a lesson for everyone who assumed control without understanding, for everyone who underestimated the quiet diligence of an informed, prepared individual. And as I walked my property in the soft light of dawn, hearing the distant calls of birds and the faint gurgle of the pond stream, I understood that the fight had never really been about the land or the courtroom. It had been about respect, foresight, and the quiet, unassailable power of knowing one's own rights. On a personal level, the experience had reinforced lessons I had always believed but rarely seen play out on such a grand scale. Knowledge, preparation, and foresight are far more potent than aggression or coercion. Systems can be manipulated, rules can be enforced selectively, and intimidation can appear formidable, but when one possesses a thorough understanding of rights, obligations, and legal frameworks, the scales of power can shift in ways that seem almost impossible to those who rely solely on surface authority. My children, too, witnessed these lessons in real time. Watching them explore the orchard, tend to the pond, and wander freely across the property without fear, I knew they were absorbing more than just the pleasures of childhood. They were learning the value of diligence, the importance of knowing one's rights, and the quiet confidence that comes from preparation. And though I never spoke to them directly about the confrontation with the HOA, the lessons were evident in my actions, the way I navigated challenges with patience, respect, and precision. It was the most powerful teaching one can impart, demonstration over instruction, example over rhetoric. The courthouse lease, in particular, became a subtle but lasting instrument of influence. While I never flaunted it, its presence alone served as a safeguard against future overreach, not only from the HOA but from any other entity that might have sought to exploit ignorance for personal gain. I maintained meticulous records, periodically reviewing terms, ensuring compliance with county regulations, and keeping the lines of communication open with administrators. This diligence guaranteed that the precedent set during the confrontation remained unassailable, that any future attempts to challenge my property or undermine community rights would face the same legal and strategic obstacles. In essence, it was more than a document, it was a safeguard, a symbol of preparedness, and a quiet assertion that authority and power are meaningful only when rooted in knowledge, legality, and foresight. As the seasons changed, the land itself seemed to reflect the restored equilibrium. The orchard flourished, the pond remained clear and vibrant, and the fields echoed with the laughter and activity of children and neighbors alike. My family thrived in the freedom and security we had fought to maintain, and the community, once tense and divided, grew into a more harmonious, engaged, and respectful environment. And through it all, I remained vigilant, aware that complacency could allow arrogance to creep back in. But the foundation I had built, both legally and morally, was strong. The HOA, a once dominant force of intimidation, now served as a historical footnote, a cautionary tale that empowered residents referenced when discussing community governance, fairness, and accountability. I often walked the property at dawn, feeling the cool air, observing the interplay of sunlight and shadow across the landscape, and reflected on the journey that had led to this point. The battle had never truly been about land, or even a courtroom. It had been about integrity, foresight, and the quiet assertion of one's rights in a world too often dominated by assumption and superficial authority. In the final assessment, the confrontation with the HOA had delivered more than legal vindication, it had reshaped an entire community. It had demonstrated that knowledge, preparation, and patience can outmatch arrogance and bureaucracy. It had reinforced the principle that power is not inherent, it is contextual and contingent, subject to the oversight and understanding of those who wield it responsibly. And perhaps most importantly, it had established a legacy, a reminder that even in the face of institutional intimidation, individuals who act with integrity and diligence can prevail, safeguard their families, and influence the broader community for the better. Walking back to the farmhouse after one of my morning inspections, I paused at the crest of a hill, looking over the fields, the pond, and the orchard, taking in the quiet splendor of the life we had built. The HOA's shadow had lifted, replaced by sunlight and possibility, and in that moment, I understood fully that victory was not measured merely in legal terms or documents, but in the restored freedom, dignity, and balance that now permeated every corner of our land and lives. And with that knowledge, I felt a deep, enduring sense of peace, knowing that the outcome, though achieved through strategy and foresight, had ultimately been a triumph of fairness, foresight, and the unassailable power of preparation.